So, Patrick, what is tendering?
So, when an organization wants to purchase an item or services, they decide that they want to go through a competitive process. Most often, it's legislated. If you're a government or arm's length organization, above a certain value of tender or of service or product, you're going to need to go to tender to ensure that there's fairness in the process and that you have really notified, you've gone through the right channels to notify people that you're going to be buying something and have allowed them to compete and put in their bid. So there's not always, you don't always have to tender everything, but it's up to the organization at the end of the day. However, people like to tender because it gives them the CYA or cover your availability. But the point of it is that if you've gone through a tender, you can then defend your decision. When someone says, why did you buy this? Why did you select that person? Why did you do this? You can say, well, we went through the tender process. And what is it about this organization or service or product that was better? Well, now it's all on record, right? So the tendering allows you to defend your decision when you're making large decisions or impactful decisions for an organization.
Great. So, RFP, what is that?
Well, there's lots of different acronyms when you get into the tendering business. An RFP is a request for proposal. It's typically a formal document, or a formal process, meaning that when an organization puts out an RFP, they are most likely going to buy something. They are prepared to buy something. They've set budget aside and they plan to buy something. So an RFP process means that, hey, we're down to the shorter strokes and we're going to be purchasing something.
So contrast that to an RFI. Why is that important?
So an RFI stands for request for information, and it's usually, if an organization were to do an RFI, it's not, I would say 25 to 30% of the time or less, they would go to RFI. An RFI is a request for information. And that is when you're not going to be buying something, or you could be buying something if the right solution or product comes along. But it's more of an informal process to really do a scan or a survey of what's out there, what's available, and what vendors would respond. So an RFI is more informal and doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a purchase. It's just really to help the organization make the right decisions. So the common practice if somebody does an RFI is they go to RFI and then they go to RFP.
So
the RFI wouldn't gain us any benefit.
What an RFQ is?
So an RFQ is a request for quote. It is typically a much smaller or less formal process. With an RFP, you're getting into responses that are, let's just say, in length from 80 to 100 pages or 60 to 100 pages. With an RFQ, you're looking at a response which is 10 pages, 10 to 20. And the RFQ document, meaning the actual request, an RFQ would be about 2 to 3 pages, where an RFP will be 30 to 40, right? So the RFQ is request for quote, and it's when the organization, it really knows exactly what they want and defines it really very formally.
And the last acronym for us to talk about, an RFSQ.
So an RFSQ is a request for supplier qualification. And what that means is it's a way of breaking up an RFP, but also making sure that you don't have to go through many large documents in a response from an RFP, or consider lots of different vendors. Because what an RFSQ is that you're saying, look, we know that we're going to want, let's just use IT services for an example. We're going to want IT services, and we're probably going to need them around, let's say, the Google Cloud, right? So they're saying an RFSQ is that let's see how many suppliers out there can qualify to provide us services for Google Cloud. And that means that you're going to get 5 or 6 responses of people saying, yes, we can do this work. And then what you do is you would ask them a bunch of questions in the RFSQ about the company, about how they work, how they supply stuff, how long they've been around. It's just, the type of questions that will build trust if you engage with them.
Okay.
And then what that allows you to do is you select a certain number from there, and then it allows you to really tighten the process of getting the particular product and or service from the organization, because you're then now talking to a smaller group of people. You're pre-qualifying them. So from a vendor's perspective, there's a couple things that we look at. And typically, a vendor would say, first of all, do I stand a chance of winning this RFP? And it doesn't matter if the services requested are exactly what the organization does. There's still a bunch of things that you have to evaluate. It's, do you know the competitive market? Do you know the client? Do you know the organization that put out the tender? So the first thing that you do as a vendor when you receive the tender is you spend days deciding if you're going to bid or not. This isn't something, it isn't like, oh, look, we got this RFP, let's respond to it. You will literally spend days. And the other thing is that when an RFP shows up, you can assume that your next week or two is already booked with activity. So when the RFP shows up, it is interrupting your workday. It's interrupting your plans for the next 2 weeks. And anybody that you go to and say, hey, let's respond to this RFP, you can assume that they're also going to be a bit upset that you have this RFP. So vendors typically don't like RFPs because it requires a tremendous amount of effort. On the administrative side, you have to look at it from the perspective of when the RFP comes out, when it's finally released, you see that there's going to be at least 4 to 5 weeks of answering vendor questions and so forth. And then when the RFPs come back, you might have 8 to 10 of them, and you have to sit down and read every one of them and mark them and grade them fairly and evaluate them fairly. Then you have to get into a room with all your coworkers and decide, okay, which one of these should be shortlisted. And then from the shortlist, then what you need to do is put together a bunch of questions so the vendors who are going to come in and present to you actually provide value and during the shortlist presentation. And then once that's done, you have to get together, again, look at all the scores, and then you're going to make a recommendation to your board, or however, about which vendor should be picked. But that's just what we've done since we've released the RFP. The long part of the work, the extensive effort, is actually writing the RFP, meaning putting questions into it, making sure that you know what you want to buy, understanding that what are the risks for the organization if you make certain decisions or ask certain questions, and how is this RFP going to benefit the organization. So when you look at it, the work from the administration work to actually author and submit an RFP and to release an RFP from start to finish, most often the internal cost of the tendering process is going to be more than the value of the product that you're buying.
Great. Let's do that last part.
So when you look at the overall cost of administering an RFP, and putting it out there, when you look at the cost of writing it and then releasing it and administering all of the vendor responses, then putting it together, one of the amazing things about this is that the cost of just the administration of the RFP is more often than not a lot more than the product that or service that you're purchasing. When you put out a tender, you will have blind spots on the product or services because you just can't know everything. You're not experts in the area. And the vendors are the experts, we hope. The vendors, you have to give them the ability to pitch alternatives so you can get the best possible response. Without these alternatives, you're shoehorning the vendors into an area which may not be beneficial for you. And in a proper RFP process, if this was a government organization, a large one or so forth, if you put out a tender and you don't allow for particular options, and someone says, hey, why don't you, they'll ask the question saying, why don't you ask for this, or, and you're just suggesting alternatives, and then you discover in the Q&A that you should have approached this differently, you have to cancel the RFP process. And you have to rewrite the RFP and then put it out again.
Okay, so now let's talk about the illusion of fairness. So talk about the purpose of an RFP, the illusion of fairness, and then...
So, the purpose of an RFP is that, you look at it from the aspect of what you're really trying to do, what you really want to do if you're putting the RFP out there, is to find the best solution, is to actually write it in a way where the vendor can respond and teach you something or tell you something you don't know. And more often than not, organizations are forced to RFP. They don't want to RFP. But the whole idea of going to tender is for competitiveness. So you can prove to the people who think the world is unfair that you went through the competitive process, that you said, hey, community, anybody that wants to bid, you can bid on this, and it's going to be fair. But there is this whole idea of the illusion of fairness, that oftentimes people, they know which vendor they want to work with when the RFP comes out. So they will bend or put sentences or frame the tender in a certain way that will allow the one vendor that they want to work with, that's the only one that can respond to it adequately. And say, well, how will they do that? That sounds like it's cheating. But it's actually very kind of straightforward in the sense that there's lots of certifications or technical merits and or awards or so forth in every type of organization. So if you think about electronic goods, you can say, is it CSA certified? Is it UL certified? And in IT products and services, oftentimes you'd have to say like, oh, you have to have this many people on staff with this type of certification for us to engage with you. Or you have to have four references in Ontario for the similar product. And if you look at things like, let's say you're working with hospitals when there is only 250 hospitals in Ontario. And if you say you have to have 4 positive references, with the way that hospitals buy and all that, that's actually pretty difficult. So if you have 4 positive references in a particular vertical, chances are that you're the only one in the province in that area. So there's ways that you can just find out information to say you must qualify like this, and they're easily defendable if somebody said, well, why did you ask for that requirement? Well, because we wanted it. This whole idea that it's fair, it's kind of, it can be unfair, and it is at times, without question. So along about fairness is that often